What's good everybody, and welcome back to yet another video on the channel. So this is Sankalp Chauhan, and if you are new here, consider subscribing to the channel because we discuss a lot about business, finance and a lot of different kind of vlogs on this channel itself. I also run a podcast called as The Sankalp Show where we invite a lot of different guests from different backgrounds and discuss about their stuff. So related to that, I actually decided to make a video on what are the top 10 podcasts that you should start listening to from now onwards. Now, I have divided the entire video into two sections. The first section actually contains the top 5 podcasts which belongs to India or the ones which are created by Indian creators. And the second half of the video will contain the podcasts which are internationally acclaimed. Without wasting much time, let's get started with the video. As I told you that the first half of the video will contain the Indian podcasts. So starting from the very first one, we have the RANVEER show. Now this podcast is actually run by RANVEER Alabatia, who is, we all know about him, and he is a media giant and a content creator. He also has a company called as Monk Entertainment, which is a media or an influence marketing company. Along with all these businesses, he also runs a podcast called the RANVEER show, in which he invites some of the most insightful guests of the entire country and also international people, right? So if you would ask me, some of my favorite episodes from his podcast are the episodes which in which he had Kunal Shah and Dr. Radhakrishnan Pillai, who is the author of Corporate Chanakya, the book you can see in the background. So these two episodes were my actually personal favorite. There are a lot of other episodes as well. You can go ahead and check that out as well. Now moving on to our list, we have something called as Mint Etc. Yes, guys. Now this is a podcast where Prasid Banerjee, who is the host of the podcast, actually discusses a lot about the new things in the tech industry. Right? He's also very famous for bursting out some myths in the tech industry. His entire motive of creating this podcast was to spread awareness about the tech industry, or to make things which seems to be complicated in a very simplified manner, so that any human being on the earth can understand what's really happening inside a tech company or things related in the tech industry. This particular podcast has been one of my favorites since a very, very long time. Now moving on to the third one, which is The Indian Dream. Now The Indian Dream is actually run by Sahil and Siddharth, who brings out some of the best entrepreneurs of the India, and they also disclose a lot about their secrets of getting funded by the VCs, and they actually run more of entrepreneurship related podcasts. They have hosted some of the greatest entrepreneurs of the country, like Karthik Sridhar, who is the founder of Flexible, and Abhinav Sinha, who is the founder of Good Do and Good Dot. Now moving on to the next, we have the Indian Silicon Valley. Now the Indian Silicon Valley is actually run by Jivraj Singh Sachar, who ignites some of the greatest conversation with entrepreneurs of the India, and he has hosted some of the greatest founders and venture capitalists and some of the domain experts, and he has been building this community since a very long time, and I have listened to a lot of his podcast episodes, and I have got some real great insights of how the world inside a company looks like, how does it really feel like to start and create a company on their own. Now the fifth and the last one in the series list of Indian podcast is Voice by Ankur Warikoo. If you are somewhere or the other active on YouTube, you must have heard about Ankur Warikoo. Ankur Warikoo is a great entrepreneur. He is the founder of nearbuys.in. He has actually raised a lot of money for his startup, and now he creates content in and around personal finance, personal development, stock market stuff, and a lot of different other things. So you must have come across his videos on YouTube one or the other time. Similar is the case with his podcast also. On his podcast, although he does not invite any or the other guest, but he shares some of the greatest advice that he has got from his life. So if you are kind of a solopreneur, or you're thinking of doing something or the other on your own, you should definitely listen to Voice by Ankur Warikoo, because he has some of the great advices for all of you guys. Now moving on to the second part of the video, which is the top 5 international podcasts that you should be listening to from now onwards. The number one category, or the number one podcast that actually comes in our mind when we hear the word podcast is called as the experiences of Joe Rogan, or the Joe Rogan experience. This is the podcast which is actually run by Joe Rogan. He's a comedian based in America. He invites some of the greatest leaders, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, and some of the people who have done some really great stuff in their lives he invites those people and records podcasts of length up to 2 to 3 hours. Now his podcast does not really feel like a kind of a podcast or something. It actually feels a very natural conversation, and it actually feels like as if you or the listener who is listening to the podcast is actually involved in that conversation, right? So it doesn't really look like that of a podcast something, right? This is what sets Joe Rogan apart from all the other people. And also he's the first one who actually signed a deal of $100 million with Spotify. One good thing that I forgot to mention about in the initial part of the video is that even RANVEER Alabadia of the RANVEER Show has signed an exclusive deal of Spotify exclusive, which means that every podcast episode that he will be uploading on YouTube will be already available 48 hours earlier on the Spotify. So this is a great success for the RANVEER Show. Now moving on to our next suggestion of the podcast, which is the NAVAL Ravikant podcast. If you use Twitter very frequently, you must have come across NAVAL Ravikant. NAVAL Ravikant is a great podcaster, is a great overall personality. He had got some real popularity from Twitter itself. He has actually raised a lot of tech companies, and he knows what exactly goes inside, knows a lot about human psychology and human nature and a lot of other things. In his podcast, he shares a lot about his thoughts and invites some of the awesome guests and authors of the books to share his experiences with books, music, and overall entrepreneurship. Now moving on to our third suggestion of the list, which is the On Purpose by Jay Shetty. Now you must have come across the content of Jay Shetty on YouTube. He makes content related to motivation, personal development, self-development, personalities, and a lot of different other things, right? He also started out with this podcast under the name of On Purpose, where he invites some of the greatest leaders and a lot of different other types of people on his podcast episode. Now some of my favorite podcast episode of his podcast or On Purpose podcast were the episodes which included David Goggins. I have actually made an entire separate video on David Goggins regarding that particular podcast episode. Yeah, so if you haven't really checked that out, go ahead and check it out right now. And the second episode was with the Yuval Noah Harari, and that episode was so much filled with knowledge and the futuristic approach that Yuval Noah Harari takes away, right? So this is one of the best podcasts if you really want to look more into people and greatest leaders of the world. Moving on to our next suggestion, which is The Master of Scales by Reid Hoffman. Now Reid Hoffman is the co-founder of LinkedIn, and he also runs a podcast called Masters of Scale. Now he is very famously known for digging out some questions from his guest. Even his guest becomes skeptical about what to answer, right? He asks some of the simplest yet so complicated questions that even the guest finds out like what to speak next, right? So this is why I really like this podcast by Master of Scale by Reid Hoffman. So the fifth and the last podcast of this entire list includes Business Wars podcast. Now this podcast is actually considered, or it actually revolves more around American markets, but if you are somewhat or the other related to the US markets or US business companies or other stuff related to US, then you should definitely go ahead with this podcast episode. What really happens in this podcast is that the host of the Business Wars actually picks up 2 or 3 businesses, and they try to find out some points of differences where there could be some rivalries or some mishappenings that could actually happen in between the businesses. Now even if 1 or 2 business come into a conflict, or they come into some of the legal happenings, then this podcast is the one that actually digs out more into like what had happened and what could possibly go wrong. So this is it with the video, guys. I really hope that you must have enjoyed this video, and you must have got some point of value from this video. So if you are really into podcasting, you should go ahead and listen to all these podcasts that I mentioned in the video, and do not forget to hit the like button, share, and subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you so much for watching the video.